What is happening, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. In this video, we will look into what is React query and how you can use it in your React project. I will also be showing you a Next.js project in which I am using React query to fetch and cache async data. So without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Now, before we go ahead and start coding right away, let's first look into what problem React query is trying to solve. Let's begin by talking about how we typically fetch data in a React application. So we will start by usually fetching the data inside useEffect hook. Once we get the data, we will have some kind of a state variable to hold that data. So let's add a state variable called products. And then once we have the state variable, we will set the products. Once we update the state, we want to basically loop through the data in our component. This is a typical flow. But now let's go ahead and add loading and error states as well. Now, before we start fetching our data, we will set the loading state to true to basically show a loader or something when the data is loading. Now, if the loading is true, we want to show a loading bar or something, a progress bar. Now, let's add an error state as well, because we want to keep track of the errors. If the API call fails, then we want to keep track of that. So once we have the error state, we will add a catch statement to our fetch call to basically update the error state in case if the API fails. Now we want to go ahead and add a if statement for our error as well. As you can see, there is already a lot of functionality to take care of. I have not yet implemented like prefetching or caching or pagination, things of that sort. Now, this is the problem React query is trying to solve. Now, if I have to replace all this code with React query, all I have to do is, let's say I have React query installed. So I'll go ahead and import React query. So what I have to do now is I simply call use query. Don't worry about the implementation right now. This is just to give you an example. I will be showing you how you can use React query in details after this. And now we can get rid of all this code. Now what React query basically here will do is React query will run this function to get the data, and it will automatically set this loading and error variables to the loading and error states, and then we can keep track of loading and error states. And once we have the data available, we can simply just loop through the data, and you can also prefetch the data if needed. And by default, React query will cache the data, and it gives you a full control of for how long you want to keep the data in cache. So now let's go ahead and dive deeper into the implementation of how React query works behind the scenes. In order to demonstrate how React query works, I have a sample project that I built using Next.js. I am using React query to basically fetch the data in this Next.js project. If you want to follow along, I'll paste a link to the Github repo for this project in the description below. You can go ahead and clone the repo and then start coding with me. So now let's go ahead and start building this project. After cloning the repo, the first thing that we want to do is install all the node modules. So I will navigate to that repo and hit yarn. If you use npm, you can also do npm install. Okay, let me clear the console and I will start the server now using yarn dev. Okay, our server has started at localhost port 3000. Let me navigate to that. As you can see, there is nothing on the screen except this header, so we are basically starting from scratch. So to use React query, what we have to do initially is we want to wrap our whole app. So basically whatever the root of your app is, you want to add query client provider, which is exported by React query. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I will go and replace these fragments with query client. Okay, cool. Now we need to pass a query client to this query client provider. So let's do that. Import query client from React query. Okay, now we will simply pass this query client to query client provider. So now we have initiated a React query functionality, so we can go ahead and start playing around with it. One thing we want to also do is we want to export this query client, because we'll be using it to basically invalidating the queries and refetching the data as well. Cool, let's go ahead and see how React query works in action now. Okay, so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to fetch all the customers and display it on the screen. So let me go ahead and import a hook called use query that comes with React query. Now let me go ahead and call that hook. Now React query accepts three parameters. The first one is called a query key. You can think of it as a variable name that you can assign your data to. So for me, it will be all customers because this is customers data. And then later we will be using this query key to basically refetch the data or invalidate the data. The second parameter is a function that will return a promise, and this function, that promise is basically responsible for fetching your data. You can use fetch function, you can use Axios, you can use pretty much anything. I like using Axios, so let me go ahead and import Axios. And here I will return Axios with the get URL of my backend. So I am hosting my backend locally as well. So I will do localhost on port 1337/API/customers. And the third parameters is basically a config for this query. We will get into that a bit later. Now let me go ahead and first console log query and to see everything else that use query returns. Let's go to inspect elements, go to console, we refresh the page. Okay, now this is everything that query returns. Now if you pay attention, as you can see, so the first thing is the data. Currently it is in undefined because the query is still fetching the data. And then you have things like error if there is an error in the API call. And then you have is fetched. It will be true once the data is finished fetching. This is loading state as well, which is set to true initially because the data is loading. And then if we go to the last console, you will see is loading is set to false. And then you also have things like refetch, remove, status, and much more. We'll get into that later. What we want to do first is we want to make sure when the data is loading, we want to return some kind of a loading indicator. So let's do that using query.isLoading and return. Now let's go ahead, refresh the page. As you can see, there's a quick flash of that loading thingy, and then it disappears because we finish fetching the data. Now the second thing that we want to add is check if there is some kind of error happened while fetching the data. Then in that scenario, what we want to do is we want to return error message basically. Okay, go ahead and refresh. Now let me change the API URL to basically show you the error state. React query will try making the call 4 times before finally declaring the yes, this is an error. Awesome. Now let me fix the API URL again. Okay, cool. We have the data. Now let's console log the data first to make sure everything is correct. Query.data. Okay, cool. And then another data to basically get to that data array. Cool. Now we get our list of customers. Awesome. So now that we have our data, let's loop through the data and display it on the screen. So what I'll do here is I'll add a table, and that table will have a row, and to that row let's add 3 table headers. Okay, awesome. So what we want to add here is name, email, and I want to add like a edit button as well. So later we will add the functionality to edit the customer. For now we'll just leave it as it is. Okay, and now let's loop through our data. So what we want to do is query.data.map customer .attributes. Okay, awesome. Now let's just return a table row, add a key. For now I'll just add index as the key itself. Usually I use a npm package called uuid for these keys and stuff. Okay, and the row data, let's add name, and for the second one we'll add email, and for the third one we'll just add the edit button. So here actually we don't need the button, we just want a string edit here. Okay, let me save it. Okay, awesome. Now as you can see, our table is displayed on the screen. Now let's add some styling to it. What I want to do is I have Tailwind installed, so I'll just add Tailwind classes 500 text white, and padding to, let's say, 4. Okay, cool. So now this is how easy it is to manage and fetch data using React Query. The next thing that we want to do is I want to show you some of the options that React Query comes with. And one of those options is called Prefetch on window focus. What that does is, for example, let me open network tab. Now currently I'm focused on the window, on the browser window itself. But let's say if I focus on the editor, and now if I go back to the window, you will see React Query will make call to customers API again. This is by default. You can disable this functionality, but this comes in really handy when you, let's say, add new data and you want that data to be displayed on the screen automatically. Let me give you an example of that. Let me just open up my backend server. Okay, just create new entry, test@gmail.com, test account. Cool. Let me hit save and publish. Now if I go back to that window tab where we have loaded React Query will automatically refetch when I focus on the tab. And as you can see, the test account is already there. This feature is really handy if you want to update the screen automatically when the data is updated, but you have the option to disable it as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So as you can see, you have refetch on window focus. You can set this to false. Now this is the object that gets passed to use query hook as the third parameter. So you can basically configure your query from here. Now that we have set the refetch on window focus to false, if you now focus on the window again, React Query will not make a call to customers API again. There you go. The second feature that I want to show you guys of React Query is prefetching the data. So let's go to a page that I added already called Prefetch. Now this page currently doesn't do anything. We can navigate to this page by just going to Prefetch. As you can see, there's nothing going on here. But what we want to do is we want to prefetch the data for all customers on this page. And then once we navigate to home page, there should be no loading screen. Like the data should automatically load directly from the cache. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing that I want to do here is import query client that we defined at the top level at _app.js. So query client, and we want to basically use this query client to fetch the data inside use effect. So that's called use effect. So inside use effect, what we want to do is query client dot prefetch query, and here we want to make sure we give it the same query key that we have given in index.js. So it's all customers, and then the same drill, we pass it a function that should return a promise. Let me import Axios here. Okay, awesome. Now let me refresh this page and we should fetch the data here. Now we have prefetched the data and tied it to this query key, all customers. Now if we go to home page, which is basically the index page, we should load the data from the cache along with making the call, but the loading data from cache should be instant. There should be no like loading screen or anything. So let's go to home page. There you go. As you can see now, even though we are making the API call, what React Query will do is React Query will load the data from cache first, and then once the API call returns the data, it will compare the data stored in cache and the data returned by the API, the API call. And if the data is the same, it won't do anything. But if the data returned by API is different, it will update the cache. Now, as you can see how easy it is to basically prefetch the data in React. Now imagine you have a bunch of APIs, you can prefetch everything all together, and then once the user navigates to pages, the user experience will be really nice. Okay, the next functionality that we want to look at is how you can update the data on the server. So let's go ahead and do that. The first one that we want to do is we want to be able to add new customer directly from this page. So let's do that first. Text white, and let's give it a padding as well, same as the other button. So py-2 px-4. Let's give it some margin as well, so margin bottom of 4. Cool, that looks good. So now whenever user clicks on this button, they should navigate to another page where they can add a new customer. So to do that, because we are using Next.js, let's import use router and initiate that hook here. On click, what we want to do is we want to use the router to push the new path on history. Let me just take a look, add new customer. So okay, awesome. Now let's test that functionality out. Cool, now we are on add new customer. Now on this page we'll basically add a super simple form that will take the data from the customer and then update the data on the screen. Cool, let's go to that page now. Okay, so on this page we want to start by initiating the use state hook to hold the customer name and the email basically. So customer and set customer. Let's add object to it and give it a name string and email of string as well. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to add 2 input fields and the button to basically hold that that name and email states. So let's do that. We want to add div which will have a label plus input. Okay, cool. We just remove this HTML4 and give it name, and the value of this will be customer dot name, and on change we basically want to update the state. Okay, cool. Let's add some styling to this input. Border, let's add some margin on the left as well. Okay, cool. I will just copy this thing and paste it for email. Okay, cool. Now let me just add some margin here. Okay, awesome. Now let's just add a button that will be responsible for basically making the API call. Let's just test it. Okay, now let's add the functionality to add customer to the database or the server. So what we want to do is we want to begin by importing use mutation hook from React query. Let's also import Axios because we are gonna need it. Axios. Okay, let's also import use router hook because we will be redirecting user back to home page once we finish adding the user. Okay, cool. So the first thing that we want to do is initiate the use mutation hook. Now use mutation hook will only take two arguments. The first is the function that will return the promise similar to use query, and the second is if there is any additional configuration you want specifically for this use mutation. So let's pass that function, return Axios method to post. URL is the backend URL for basically adding new customer. Okay, cool. Now this use mutation hook will also return bunch of things. For example, it'll also return is loading. So let me just show you. So it returns is loading, which you can basically utilize when the API call is adding new customer to the backend. In our scenario, because I'm hosting localhost, like the backend server on localhost, so I won't be using it, but you can, the option is there. So let's go ahead, and whenever this is clicked, what we want to do is we want to call a function called mutate that is returned by basically use mutation. Cool. Now let's go ahead and test it. So the API call is failing with method not allowed. The reason for that is instead of customers, it is customers with S. Okay, let's test it now. Okay, awesome. So we have successfully added a new customer. Now after we adding the customer, what we want to do is we want to basically return the user back to home page. So let's do that. Let's initiate use router hook. Now for the second parameter to use mutation, you don't pass other config. Instead you have option to all these life cycle methods of the API call. So for example, on success you can basically say when the API call is successful, do this. So in my scenario, what we'll do is on success we will just redirect the user back to home page. Cool. Let's add another customer. Okay, we got redirected to home page. Now let's see if we have the updated customers. Yes, we do. So awesome, we got all the list of customers, the newly added ones as well. Now this is pretty much how you can perform mutations in using React query. Okay, now that we have finished the functionality for adding new customer, now let's work on editing the existing customers. So let's go back to index.js, which is our homepage file, and what we want to do is whenever someone clicks on this button, we want to redirect them to the edit page. Okay, router dot push, let me just confirm the name, edit customer. Cool, the name of the page is edit customer. Awesome. So now instead of passing just the string to push, we want to pass it an object path name to /edit customer and query to name and email, and we also want to pass customer ID that we can access using customer.id. So now let's test this if this redirecting works. So if I click on this, do we have the name and everything in the URL? Yes, we do. Okay, cool. Now the next thing that we want to do is we basically want to just copy the code from add new customer and paste it in edit customer, because it's pretty much the same. Okay, now what we want to do is, because we have the values, the customer values saved in the query, we want to get that from the query itself, and we can use this router variable to do that. So what we have to do is router dot query dot name and router dot query dot email. Okay, cool. Now the names and emails are showing up in the input fields as expected. So the next thing that we want to do is inside the use mutation, we want to replace post with put, and the customers, we want to append the customer ID. For the URL, we want to append the customer ID to the end. Okay, awesome, cool. Now let's test this. Okay, hit edit. Okay, cool. So we got 200. That's good. And as you can see on the screen, we edited this customer and now it has this testing string attached to it. Cool. This is how you can use React query to basically perform mutations on the server to add content or delete content on the server. Now before we end this tutorial, the last thing I wanted to show you guys is refetch interval. So refetch interval, basically you can specify how often do you want the React query to make API calls. So for example, for our all customers query, I will set refetch interval to, let's say, 1000, which is in milliseconds. So every 1 second React query will make a request to fetch the customers. As you can see in the network tab, we are continuously fetching the data. This is good if you have your server will keep on updating the data on the server and you want that data to be always displayed on the front end. So for me, I'll just remove it for now. Now this is pretty much how React query works behind the scenes. There's a lot more to React query than what I demonstrated, so make sure you go to the docs and read through, because there's a lot more functionality that React query comes with. I will post links to the GitHub repo and React query documentation in the description below. If you guys like the video, if this video brought any value to you, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.